A storm brews over the plains of Abilene, where a young woman, alone, abandoned, and carrying the weight of her secret, arrives at the gates of a stranger's ranch. The rain hides her tears, the wind silences her fear, but nothing can protect her from the whispers of a town that refuses to forgive. And when a quiet, haunted rancher opens his door to her, compassion ignites a spark neither of them dares to name. What begins as an act of mercy soon becomes a battle between past and redemption, between duty and forbidden desire. If you love timeless romances filled with passion, struggle, and second chances, subscribe now and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support keeps these stories alive. Abilene, Texas, 1882. The morning light crept over the flat horizon, soft and golden, casting long shadows on the dusty street. Wagons rolled past in slow rhythm, their wheels carving shallow lines into the earth, while the wind lifted the scent of horse sweat and mesquite from the open prairie. Amid the stir of men unloading supplies and women hurrying to the general store, a young woman stepped off a freight wagon, clutching a small cloth bundle to her chest as though it were the last thing keeping her upright. Maggie Caldwell, Maggie, as her mother once called her, was only 17, yet her eyes held the weariness of someone twice her age. Her calico dress, faded from travel and sun, brushed against her ankles, and the thin shawl around her shoulders did little to hide the gentle curve of her pregnancy. The townsfolk noticed. They always did. Some glanced away quickly, others whispered behind gloved hands, their expressions tightening with the disapproval reserved for those who had fallen from grace. Maggie lifted her chin, though her heart trembled. She had traveled for 3 weeks from Missouri, through dust and loneliness, after her father's death and her lover's cruel abandonment. The man who had promised her marriage had left her with nothing but shame and a child stirring quietly within her. Now she stood in a town that judged before asking, where respectability mattered more than kindness. She stopped in front of a wooden sign reading Mrs. Lenora Briggs' boarding house. The building was narrow and proper, its porch swept clean. Maggie pressed her palms together, took a breath, and knocked. The door opened to a stout woman in a dark dress and lace collar, her gray hair pinned into a tight bun. Her eyes flicked from Maggie's face to her stomach and back again. "What is it you're looking for?" the woman asked, her voice clipped. "A room, ma'am, just a small one," Maggie answered softly. "I can pay for a week." Mrs. Briggs studied her, pursed her lips, and then sighed with the resignation of someone who disliked her own charity. "Upstairs, last door at the end of the hall, payment in advance, and you'll keep to yourself." "Yes, ma'am," Maggie whispered, offering the few coins she had left. The room was little more than a cot, a basin, and a cracked window pane that let in more wind than light. Still, it was shelter. She sank onto the bed, pressing her hands to her abdomen. "You're safe now," she murmured to the child. "We'll find a way." By afternoon, Maggie walked the streets again, searching for work. She stopped at the mercantile, the dressmakers, even the church. Each place met her with polite refusals or thinly veiled disgust. It was in the window of the general store that she saw it, a neatly written notice pinned to the wood. "Help wanted. Housekeeper and cook for small ranch outside town. Respectable conduct required. Inquire at Whitaker Ranch." Her fingers trembled as she touched the paper. Respectable conduct. The words stung, but the chance felt like mercy. She turned to ask directions and found herself face to face with a tall man exiting the store. He was broad-shouldered, his coat dusted with the pale red earth of the plains. A felt hat shaded his eyes, but not enough to hide their calm grey color. "Pardon me," he said, stepping aside with measured courtesy. "I'm sorry," she stammered, lowering her gaze. "It's all right." His voice was low, even, with a trace of something that sounded like restraint. He touched the brim of his hat, then continued on, his stride deliberate and steady. Maggie watched him disappear down the street, unaware that she had just met Thomas Whitaker, the man whose name was written on the notice she held. The walk to his ranch the next morning was long and hot. The plains stretched endlessly, golden and wild beneath the Texas sun. A windmill creaked in the distance, and cattle grazed in the tall grass beyond the fence line. When she reached the gate, she hesitated. The house beyond was modest but strong, built of timber and stone, surrounded by fields of horses. A ranch hand appeared, Silas Garner, a man of few words but sharp eyes. He regarded her carefully before calling out, "Mr. Whitaker, someone to see you!" Thomas emerged from the barn, sleeves rolled up, his vest unbuttoned. He wiped his hands on a cloth as he approached. The sight of him up close startled Maggie. He looked older than she had imagined, perhaps in his early 40s, with the air of a man who carried more responsibility than comfort. "You're here about the notice?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said, holding the paper tightly. "I can cook, clean, and mend. I don't need much." He studied her quietly, his gaze steady, but not unkind. "How old are you?" 17. He hesitated, then nodded once. "You've worked on a ranch before." "My father had land in Missouri," she replied, her voice small. "I can do what's needed." Silas shifted behind him, skeptical. "We don't usually hire young women alone, boss," he murmured. "I'll decide that," Thomas said evenly. His eyes returned to Maggie. "You'll have a roof, meals, and a fair wage. You'll do your duties properly, and you'll keep to the ranch unless sent into town." Relief rushed through her chest so quickly it made her dizzy. "Thank you, sir. I won't be any trouble." "See that you're not," he replied, turning back toward the barn. "Silas, show her the kitchen." As the day wore on, Maggie scrubbed the floors, prepared supper, and lit the evening lamps. Her hands ached, but the work brought her a fragile peace. The house smelled of wood smoke and coffee. For the first time in months, she felt she belonged somewhere, however temporarily. When night fell, she stepped outside. The horizon glowed faintly with the last traces of daylight. Thomas stood a few yards away, checking the horses. The sound of their hooves mixed with the rustle of dry grass. Maggie hesitated, then spoke softly. "Thank you for giving me a chance, Mr. Whitaker." He turned toward her, removing his hat. "I don't offer chances," he said quietly. "Only work, but you're welcome to it." Their eyes met, hers full of unspoken gratitude, his cautious, curious, almost reluctant. Something unnamed passed between them, faint as the scent of rain on distant dust. When he walked away, Maggie lingered on the porch, her hands resting over her child. The wind lifted her hair, and the stars began to pierce the sky. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, she let herself breathe, and somewhere deep in the silence of that Texas night, something began, a feeling too small to name, but strong enough to change the course of both their lives forever. The sun had not yet cleared the rim of the horizon when Maggie rose from the narrow bed in the small room Thomas Whitaker had given her. The light was pale and tender, drifting through the single window like a promise she was afraid to believe. She dressed quietly, fastening the worn buttons of her calico gown, and braided her hair with trembling hands. Outside, the morning air was cool and smelled faintly of sagebrush and dew. A rooster crowed somewhere near the stables, and the ranch began to stir awake. Her duties had been clearly laid out the evening before: prepare breakfast, wash the dishes, sweep the porch, and tend to small tasks in the kitchen garden. She was grateful for the structure. It steadied her mind, silenced the worries that chased her whenever she allowed herself to think too far ahead. By the time the men came in from the stables, coffee was brewing on the stove, and the scent of bacon filled the modest kitchen. Thomas entered first, tall and deliberate in his movements, the early light drawing soft gold through the dark strands of his hair. He paused at the doorway, removing his hat, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Miss Caldwell," he said. "Good morning, sir," she replied, lowering her gaze to hide the nervous flutter in her chest. Silas followed him in, offering a quiet nod before taking a seat at the table. Maggie set the plates down carefully, aware of Thomas's silent observation. His presence filled the room, not by force, but by gravity. He was a man accustomed to order, to the rhythm of land and labor, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny like sunlight on her skin. He ate little, speaking only when necessary. Yet when Maggie poured his coffee, his voice softened just enough to stir something fragile inside her. "The eggs are well done," he remarked. "You've a steady hand." She blushed faintly, her fingers tightening around the pot. "Thank you, sir. I used to cook for my family." "Then they were fortunate," he said simply, and went back to his meal. It was such an ordinary exchange, but for Maggie it felt extraordinary. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her without pity or suspicion. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to feel human again. The day unfolded in slow rhythm. Maggie scrubbed the wooden floors, laundered linens in the sun, and baked bread that filled the air with warmth. She worked until her shoulders ached, losing herself in the repetition. From the window, she could see Thomas crossing the yard, his stride purposeful as he inspected the corrals. Sometimes he spoke with Silas, sometimes to the horses, his voice low and steady. There was something about him that commanded quiet respect, not fear, not admiration, but a kind of trust she could not explain. In the afternoon the heat grew heavy, and she went to fetch water from the well. The handle creaked as she turned it, drawing the bucket up with both hands. She did not hear him approach until his shadow stretched beside hers. "You shouldn't carry that alone," he said, taking the bucket before she could protest. "I can manage," she answered softly. "I don't doubt it," he replied, "but there's no need to prove it." Their eyes met briefly, and the moment lingered, suspended between them like breath. She looked away first, her pulse unsteady. He carried the bucket into the kitchen and set it down with care. "Thank you," she murmured, unable to meet his gaze. He only nodded, his tone calm but thoughtful. "You've done a full day's work already. Rest while you can. The sun here doesn't forgive anyone." When he left, Maggie sank onto the small stool near the window, watching the dust rise from the road. The vastness of Texas spread before her, endless, golden, merciless. And yet, in this quiet place, surrounded by silence and wind, she began to feel a strange peace she hadn't known in months. That evening she set the table again. Thomas returned from the stables after sunset, his shirt damp at the collar, his hands rough with dust. He washed at the basin outside before entering, and for a moment the lamplight caught the edges of his face, the tired lines, the steadiness of his mouth. Maggie noticed the faint scar near his jaw, the kind that spoke of work, not war. They ate together in comfortable silence. Silas had gone to town for supplies, leaving them alone in the soft glow of the oil lamp. Outside, the crickets sang, and the wind pressed against the window pane like a sigh. "You've kept the place tidy," Thomas said after a while. "It's good to keep busy," she replied. He leaned back slightly, studying her. "Most who come here can't stand the quiet. It's too empty for them." She folded her hands in her lap. "After the places I've been, silence feels like mercy." His eyes softened, though his expression remained composed. "You've known hard things." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "Yes, sir." He hesitated, as if weighing whether to ask more, then said quietly, "You don't have to speak of them. You've earned your rest here. That's enough." Something inside her gave way, a small, trembling sigh of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. The gratitude in her voice stirred something in him, something he had long buried under duty and solitude. He rose to his feet, walking toward the doorway, but paused before stepping outside. "You can call me Mr. Whitaker," he said gently, "but you don't need to say sir every time. I'm not your overseer." She smiled faintly. "Habit, Mr. Whitaker. Old habits are hard to break." He inclined his head. "Then we'll start with small ones." After he left, she sat for a long time, her heart beating softly beneath the weight of her own thoughts. The air smelled of rain, though the sky was still clear. When she finally went to bed, she could still feel the echo of his words, calm and protective, lingering in the quiet. The next days settled into a steady pattern. Maggie's hands found purpose again, kneading dough, mending curtains, polishing silverware dulled by years of neglect. The house began to change under her care. Windows that had long been shut were opened, letting in the scent of fresh grass. Even Silas, gruff and quiet, began to soften, leaving small offerings on the kitchen table, fresh apples, wildflowers, an extra pail of water. Yet it was Thomas who unsettled her the most. He remained distant, never unkind, but always measured. She caught him watching her sometimes, not with desire, but with an expression that was almost puzzlement, as though he were trying to understand why this young woman, fragile and bruised by life, had stirred something in the order he prized so deeply. One afternoon, while polishing the brass lamp in the parlor, she cut her hand on the edge of the glass. A sharp gasp escaped her, and blood welled bright against her pale skin. She wrapped it quickly in a rag, but a firm voice behind her made her stop. "Let me see." Thomas crossed the room in 2 strides. His hands were gentle as he unwrapped the cloth, examining the small cut. "It's shallow," he murmured, his thumb brushing just above the wound. The touch sent a tremor through her. "Still, it needs to be cleaned." "It's nothing," she whispered. He looked up then, and the distance between them vanished. "Everything matters when it comes to what's yours to keep safe," he said softly. "Hands, heart, even hope." Her breath caught. For a moment neither moved. The silence grew thick with something unspoken, fragile and dangerous. Then he stepped back, his composure returning like armor. "There's salve in the drawer near the stove. Use it." "Yes, Mr. Whitaker." He nodded once and left the room, but his voice stayed with her long after the door closed. That night, a storm rolled across the plains. The air smelled of wet dust, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Maggie stood by the window, her candle flickering. Rain had always comforted her. It drowned out the world's cruelty, replacing judgment with sound and shadow. But tonight, it brought loneliness. She was not alone in feeling it. Thomas sat by the fire downstairs, a ledger open before him, though he had stopped reading long ago. The house felt too alive, the air too heavy. He could hear her footsteps above, slow and light, like a memory he could not erase. When the thunder broke overhead, she startled and a moment later came softly down the stairs. "Mr. Whitaker," she said from the doorway. "The windows are rattling. I thought perhaps I should close them." He looked up, setting the ledger aside. "Leave them be. The air needs to move through." She hesitated, clutching her shawl. The lamplight glowed behind him, painting his profile in amber tones. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his forearms, his collar undone. The sight of him, so still, so certain, stirred an ache she didn't dare name. He gestured toward the chair opposite him. "You can wait here until the storm passes." Maggie obeyed quietly, sitting near the fire. The warmth reached her cheeks, softening the chill in her hands. For a long while neither spoke. The rain beat against the windows, steady and insistent. "You've built a good life here," she said at last. "It's peaceful." He smiled faintly, though without joy. "Peace is a kind of silence, Miss Caldwell. It keeps a man from remembering too much." "Do you remember often?" she asked gently. His gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. "Every day." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then perhaps peace isn't silence. Perhaps it's finding someone who listens." The words fell between them like a confession neither had planned to make. The fire crackled softly, and for one suspended heartbeat, Thomas allowed himself to look at her, really look at her. The delicate curve of her neck, the sincerity in her eyes, the strength hidden behind her gentleness. When lightning flashed, he rose abruptly, walking to the window. "You should rest," he said quietly. "Morning comes early." She stood too, gathering her shawl. "Good night, Mr. Whitaker." He turned halfway toward her, his voice low. "Good night, Miss Caldwell." As she climbed the stairs, the storm raged on outside, but inside the house, something else had begun to stir, a different kind of thunder, quiet but powerful, building between 2 hearts that had both forgotten what warmth felt like. And though neither dared name it yet, it was there, unmistakable, fragile as dawn breaking over the lonely plains of Abilene. The morning broke over the plains in soft shades of rose and gold, brushing the Whitaker ranch with the fragile calm that only came before heat and labor. Maggie awoke to the faint sounds of hooves in the distance and the rhythm of men working outside. The smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen where she had fallen asleep beside the hearth. Her hands still bore traces of flour, and her hair, half loosened from its braid, caught the pale light like ribbons of chestnut. She stretched quietly and looked toward the open window. The world beyond it shimmered with the promise of another long day. And yet, beneath the peace of that morning, something restless stirred inside her, an unease she could neither name nor dispel. By the time Thomas entered for breakfast, the table was already set. She greeted him softly, though her heart always seemed to quicken at his presence. He was freshly shaven, his dark hair still damp from the well water. There was something unspoken in the way he carried himself, a calm that felt both reassuring and unreachable. "Morning, Miss Caldwell," he said, removing his hat. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker." She placed a bowl of eggs on the table, careful not to meet his eyes for too long. He nodded approvingly. "You're up earlier than most." "Habit," she said with a faint smile. "The mornings feel safer somehow, before the world wakes up and starts judging." He looked at her then, just long enough for her to feel the weight of his understanding. "There's a lot the morning hides," he murmured, then took his seat. They ate in silence for a while, the faint clatter of dishes filling the space between them. The air seemed different today, heavier somehow, though the sky was clear. Maggie could feel his attention even when he wasn't looking at her, as though something had begun to change in the quiet rhythm of their days. It happened near noon, when the sun hung high and unforgiving over the fields. Maggie was carrying a pail of water from the well when she stumbled, gripping her side. The weight of the bucket slipped from her hands, splashing across the dry earth. Pain tightened around her ribs, sharp and sudden, and she bent forward, gasping. "Maggie!" Thomas's voice cut through the brightness like a shadow. He had seen her from the barn and was at her side in moments. "What happened?" She shook her head, embarrassed, trying to straighten. "It's nothing, just dizzy for a moment." He frowned, steadying her arm. "You've been working too much. Sit down before you fall." "I can't rest. There's still—" "You'll rest," he said firmly. His tone left no room for argument. He guided her toward the shade of the porch, his hands steady against her back. Maggie obeyed, her cheeks flushed, not only from the heat but from the closeness of him, the smell of leather and dust, the warmth of his palm. She felt fragile and foolish, like a secret she could no longer hide. Thomas knelt beside her, his brow furrowed. "You've been pale these past days," he said quietly, "and you eat so little. Are you ill?" Her breath caught. The question had been inevitable, and yet she had prayed it would never come. "I'm not ill," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He studied her, his grey eyes narrowing as realization began to form. "Then what is it?" Maggie turned away, clutching her shawl tighter. "Please, Mr. Whitaker, don't ask me." "I already have," he said gently but firmly. For a long moment the world seemed to stand still, the cicadas, the wind, even the restless horses in the pasture. She felt the truth pressing against her chest like a confession demanding to be spoken. "I'm with child," she said at last, her voice trembling. "I was left alone before I came here. The man who promised to marry me, he disappeared before anyone knew. My father died soon after, and my family sent me away. I didn't know where else to go." Thomas's expression did not change at first, but the silence that followed was heavy enough to make her wish she had lied. "You should have told me," he said after a long pause, his voice quiet but stern. "I thought you'd send me away," she whispered, "and I had nowhere left." He rose slowly, his hand tightening on the railing. "You knew what people would think if they found out you were living here, alone, with me." "I know," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I tried to hide it. I tried to be useful, to earn my place." He looked out toward the horizon, the line of his jaw hardening. "Abilene isn't a kind town. They'll make stories out of this before the day is done if anyone finds out. I never meant to bring shame to your name, she said, rising to her feet. If you want me gone, I'll leave now. He turned back to her sharply. Don't say that. Her eyes widened, startled by the edge in his tone. I don't throw people out into the dust, Miss Caldwell, he said, his voice low but resolute. You'll stay. You'll work as before. I'll handle the rest. She shook her head. But your reputation... Let me worry about that, he interrupted. You'll be safe here. I promise you that. The words carried a weight she hadn't expected, a quiet conviction that went beyond pity. It was the kind of promise that made her knees weaken and her heart ache. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for me? Thomas's gaze softened, though he said nothing for a moment. Because I've seen what happens to people who are left with no one to stand for them. And because... He stopped himself, looking away. Because I couldn't live with myself if I turned you out. Maggie felt tears blur her vision. She wanted to thank him, but gratitude seemed too small for what she felt. You've been kind to me, Mr. Whitaker, she said quietly. More than I deserve. He met her eyes then, and the air between them seemed to pulse. Don't mistake decency for kindness, he murmured. I'm not half as good as you think. The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than anger would have. There was something in him, loneliness perhaps, or guilt, that mirrored her own. And it drew her to him in a way that frightened her as much as it comforted her. For the rest of the afternoon, the ranch moved in its usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Thomas kept to his work, but his thoughts were scattered. Every time he caught sight of her moving about the house, quiet, careful, with her hands pressed to her growing secret, his chest tightened. He had never intended to care about what happened under his roof beyond the limits of duty. Yet here he was, bound by something deeper than obligation. That evening the air grew heavy with the scent of rain again. The sky turned violet, and thunder rolled far away. Maggie stood on the porch, staring toward the horizon, when Thomas stepped out beside her. You can see the storms coming for miles here, he said, his voice quiet. Yes, she murmured. In Missouri they came faster. You never had time to prepare. He nodded, folding his arms as he leaned against the railing. You learn to watch the wind here. It tells you when trouble's coming. She turned to him, her expression solemn. You think I've brought trouble to your door? I think trouble has a way of finding people who don't deserve it, he said. And you've had enough of it. For a moment they stood in silence, the faint wind lifting the edge of her shawl. When she looked up at him, her eyes shone with a vulnerability that made his breath catch. Sometimes I wish I could start over, she confessed. Somewhere no one knows my name. He looked down at her, his voice low and steady. Then start here. Let this place be enough for now. Her throat tightened. You make it sound so simple. It isn't simple, he admitted. But it's possible. Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to hum. He wanted to reach out, to brush the hair from her face, but he restrained himself. The faint tremor in his hand betrayed the struggle within him. When the first drops of rain began to fall, Maggie shivered. Thomas removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders. His touch was brief but careful, and she could feel the warmth of him through the fabric. You'll catch cold, he said quietly. She clutched the coat closer, the scent of him filling her senses. You don't have to look after me. Maybe not, he replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But I will. The rain came harder then, drumming softly on the roof. For a long while they stood together, saying nothing. The distance between them felt fragile, neither safe nor dangerous, only inevitable. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I don't know how to thank you. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable, but his tone filled with quiet gravity. You don't owe me anything, Maggie. Just be honest. That's all I ask. I will, she said. From now on. Good. She looked up at him one last time before retreating inside, the lamplight spilling over her shoulders as she disappeared through the door. Thomas remained on the porch, the rain darkening his shirt, his thoughts tangled. He knew that by morning, everything in Abilene would look the same. The sky, the dust, the fields, but nothing within these walls would ever be untouched again. Inside, Maggie sat by the dying fire, holding the edge of his coat close to her chest. It smelled of cedar and smoke and somehow of safety. She closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for one quiet moment, that she wasn't a girl the world had forgotten, but a woman seen at last, without judgment. And though she could not name it yet, she knew that something profound had taken root between them, delicate and forbidden as the first bloom of spring in a land that had long forgotten softness. The days that followed drifted by like dust through sunlight, quiet on the surface, yet restless beneath. The rhythm of ranch life continued, though something fragile now linked the air between Thomas and Maggie. Their every glance carried the memory of that afternoon on the porch, when rain had turned confession into promise, without a single word spoken. Spring had deepened into summer, and the land began to thirst beneath the relentless Texas sun. The wheat shimmered pale and brittle across the horizon, and the air seemed to hum with heat. Each morning, Maggie rose before dawn, tying her hair into a tight braid and washing her face in cool water from the basin. Her body grew heavier with each passing week, yet she moved with the quiet persistence of someone determined to earn her place. Thomas noticed. He saw the way she pressed a hand to her lower back when she thought no one watched, the faint strain in her steps as she crossed the yard carrying buckets of feed. He wanted to help, to ease her burdens, but he also feared overstepping the delicate boundary that held them together in this fragile peace. One morning, after she had finished her chores, he found her near the barn, her apron streaked with flour and her cheeks flushed with color. "You should rest," he said from behind her. She turned, startled, brushing a loose strand of hair from her temple. "I can't. The bread's rising, and the sheets still need to be rinsed. You'll wear yourself thin." Maggie smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "I've been thin since I arrived here, Mr. Whitaker. I wouldn't know what to do if I stopped moving." Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've already done enough to prove yourself. No one here doubts your worth." Her breath caught at the sound of his tone, soft, sincere, carrying something that felt dangerously like affection. "It isn't about proving myself," she said quietly. "It's about staying useful. If I stop, I'll remember too much." He wanted to say her name, to tell her she didn't need to run from the past anymore, but the words stayed locked in his throat. Instead, he nodded once and walked away, his silence heavier than any reprimand. Later that week, Thomas sent Silas into town for supplies and asked Maggie to accompany him. She hesitated, wary of the stares that always seemed to follow her in Abilene, but the ranch needed flour and salt, and she refused to let fear rule her again. She dressed modestly in a light brown cotton gown, with a small bonnet and white gloves, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The wagon rattled down the dirt road under the searing midday sun. Silas sat beside her, guiding the horses, his quiet presence a comfort. The landscape passed in waves of yellow grass and red soil, broken only by the occasional windmill. When they reached the edge of town, Maggie's heart began to race. The streets were busy, women in pressed skirts, men in dust-covered boots, children darting between horses. She kept her eyes low as she followed Silas into the mercantile, clutching the list Thomas had written. Inside, the cool shade of the store offered no refuge from judgment. Conversations hushed as soon as she stepped through the door. Mrs. Briggs stood by the counter, her sharp gaze narrowing. The woman's lips curled into a faint, satisfied smile. "Well, if it isn't Miss Caldwell," she said loudly enough for others to hear, "I was beginning to think Mr. Whitaker had hidden you away for good." Maggie froze, color draining from her face. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Briggs," she murmured. "Afternoon," the older woman replied, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "It's brave of you to come into town considering how people talk." Silas's hand tightened on the counter. "That's enough, Mrs. Briggs," he said evenly. "Oh, I mean no harm," she insisted, though her eyes gleamed with malice. "But folks will wonder, you know. A young lady expecting living alone out there with a man twice her age. It gives a certain impression." Maggie wanted the floor to swallow her whole. The other customers exchanged glances, some whispering behind their hands. Her throat burned and her vision blurred, but she stood her ground. "You can think what you like," she said softly, "but Mr. Whitaker has shown me more decency than most ever did." The room fell silent. Mrs. Briggs blinked, taken aback by the quiet strength in Maggie's voice. Silas gathered the supplies quickly, and together they left the store, Maggie's pulse echoing in her ears. By the time they returned to the ranch, the sun had dipped low. Thomas was waiting by the fence, his arms crossed. He saw her pale face and stiff posture, and knew something had gone wrong. "What happened?" he asked, his tone calm but taut. "Nothing," she said too quickly, handing Silas the list. "Just gossip." Silas shook his head. "It was Mrs. Briggs again. She's spreading filth, boss." Thomas's jaw tightened. "What did she say?" Maggie stepped forward, her voice barely steady. "It doesn't matter. People will believe what they want." "It matters to me," he said sharply. Then, seeing her flinch, he softened his tone. "You shouldn't have to face that alone." "I'm used to it," she whispered. "I don't want you to be." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world around them disappeared. The distant sound of cattle, the hum of cicadas, the weight of the setting sun. He took a step closer, his gaze searching hers as though he were trying to find the right words, and couldn't. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, her voice trembling. He cut her off gently. "Thomas, when we're here, call me Thomas." Her breath caught. "I couldn't." "You could," he said softly. "And you should." The sound of his name on her tongue would have felt too intimate, too dangerous. She lowered her eyes, afraid he might see the turmoil written across her face. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, the ranch fell into silence, but neither of them slept easily. Thomas sat in his chair by the fire, staring into the flames, the echoes of Mrs. Briggs's cruelty circling in his mind. He knew the town's nature well enough. Abilene was built on reputation, and reputations were torn down faster than fences in a storm. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, the moon hung low, silvering the yard and the fields beyond. Through the faint light, he could see Maggie's window on the second floor, a single candle flickering behind the curtain. Meanwhile, Maggie sat on the edge of her bed, the shawl still draped around her shoulders. The weight of the day pressed down on her until her eyes filled with tears. She tried to pray, but found no words that seemed to fit. Only silence answered, heavy and cold. Then a sound outside startled her, a faint creak of the gate, followed by the distant echo of hooves. She went to the window and peered out. A lone rider was moving slowly along the fence line, his hat low over his face. He paused for a moment, glancing toward the house before turning his horse and vanishing into the darkness. A shiver ran through her. She wrapped the shawl tighter and stepped away from the window. Moments later, she heard footsteps on the porch below. Thomas's voice rose softly. "Maggie, are you awake?" She hesitated before opening her door and leaning over the stair rail. "Yes, Mr. Whitaker." He looked up at her from the foot of the stairs, his expression grave. "Did you see a rider near the fence just now?" "Yes, he stopped for a moment, then rode off." "I saw him too," he said. "Probably just someone passing through, but I don't like it. Keep the windows locked tonight." "Do you think he meant harm?" He shook his head. "No, but out here, it's better to be cautious." She nodded, then hesitated. "Thank you for looking out for me." His gaze held hers for a long moment. "You don't need to thank me. It's my duty to keep this place safe." "It feels like more than duty," she whispered. His expression softened, but he said nothing. Words were dangerous things, and the truth between them already trembled like glass. When he turned to leave, she called after him, "Good night, Thomas." He froze, his hand on the banister. Slowly he looked back up at her. "Good night, Maggie," he said, his voice deep and low. When she returned to her room, her heart was pounding, her lips tingling as though she had spoken something forbidden. She blew out the candle, but the darkness did not bring peace, only the echo of his name and the weight of everything that could not yet be said. Downstairs, Thomas remained by the window, watching the horizon. The night was quiet again, but the silence felt different now, charged, watchful, as though the land itself were waiting. He knew the world would keep its teeth bared, that the whispers in Abilene would only grow sharper. But as he stood there, the sound of her voice lingered in his mind, soft as the wind and twice as dangerous. And for the first time in years, he found himself praying, not for mercy or rain or redemption, but for the strength to protect what had already begun to mean far too much. The summer air pressed heavily over the plains, thick with dust and the scent of rain that never came. Abilene's days had grown longer and crueler, each one stretching endlessly beneath a sky too bright to bear. The heat shimmered against the earth, bending the horizon like a mirage, and Maggie often felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. At the Whitaker ranch, time moved differently. The steady rhythm of work, the sound of horses in the corral, the creak of wooden fences, the rustle of wind through tall grass, gave a fragile sense of order to a life that was otherwise uncertain. Yet beneath that calm, something uneasy stirred, an unseen shadow slipping quietly back into their lives. Maggie first sensed it before she knew its name. One afternoon, while hanging washed linens in the yard, she felt the strange prickle of being watched. The sun glared over her bonnet, but the feeling persisted, a faint pressure, like eyes following her every move. She turned toward the road, half expecting to find Thomas returning from town, but there was only dust and wind. Still, her pulse quickened. Inside the house, she tried to shake the feeling. She kneaded bread until her hands ached, swept the floors twice, and arranged the fresh flowers Silas had brought from the creek bed. But when Thomas returned that evening, she was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to the window each time the wind shifted. He noticed at once. "Something's troubling you," he said, setting his gloves on the table. "It's nothing," she replied quickly. "Just the heat. It makes one restless." He stepped closer, his brow furrowing. "You've never been a woman who hides behind excuses." Her lips parted as if to deny it, but the truth pressed too heavily against her chest. "I felt someone watching today. I thought I saw movement near the road." Thomas's expression darkened. "A rider?" "I couldn't tell. Perhaps it was nothing. Or perhaps not," he murmured. He moved to the window, scanning the distant fields. The evening light cast him in warm tones, highlighting the sharp lines of his face and the quiet strength in his posture. Maggie watched him from the doorway, torn between fear and comfort. When he turned back to her, his gaze softened. "You're safe here, Maggie. No one will harm you while you're under my roof." His words should have soothed her, but instead they sparked something deeper, a dangerous kind of longing that had nothing to do with fear. That night, she dreamt of footsteps in the dark, of voices she hadn't heard in months. When she woke before dawn, her pillow was damp with tears. 2 days later, the unease found its name. Silas rode back from town with a look that spoke more than words. Thomas met him in the yard, and Maggie, standing at the kitchen window, felt the air tighten around her. "There's talk," Silas said grimly. "That gambler, Jace Mallory, he's back in Abilene." Thomas's jaw clenched. "Mallory?" "Aye. He's been seen at the saloon near Main Street, asking questions about you and the girl." Thomas glanced toward the house. Through the window he saw Maggie bent over the table, arranging herbs into neat bundles. "She doesn't know?" Silas shook his head. "Not yet, but she will soon enough. Word travels fast in this town." Thomas nodded slowly, his thoughts turning hard. Let him talk. He won't find what he's looking for. But deep down, he knew gossip was a weapon more dangerous than any gun. That evening the sky turned the color of tarnished copper. The wind carried the scent of coming rain and something else, trouble. Maggie was setting supper on the table when Thomas entered, his expression unreadable. "You've been quiet all day," she said, trying to read him. Did something happen? He hesitated. He had promised her honesty, and yet he hated the thought of bringing that man's shadow back into her heart. Someone's come back to Abilene, he said finally. A man you once knew. Her hands froze over the plates. Who? Jace Mallory. The name struck her like a slap. For a moment she could not breathe. The sound of it pulled her back to a world she had fought to forget. The laughter in smoky saloons, the whispered lies beneath starlight, the promise that turned to abandonment. He's here, she whispered. Yes, but you don't need to be afraid. I'll see to it he stays away. Maggie's voice trembled. You don't understand what he's capable of. He'll twist anything to his advantage. He always does. Thomas stepped closer, his gaze steady and protective. Then let him try. He won't get past me. Her eyes filled with tears. You shouldn't have to fight my past. It isn't just your past anymore, he said quietly. It's ours, if you'll let it be. For a heartbeat, she forgot to breathe. His words carried the weight of something far greater than duty. Yet before she could reply, thunder cracked across the sky, breaking the moment apart. That night, Abilene glowed dimly in the distance as Jace Mallory rode through the muddy streets, his boots polished and his grin sharp. Time had not changed him. He was still the same gambler with charm like poisoned honey and eyes that measured everything they touched. When he leaned against the bar, his voice slid easily into the ears of men who loved to trade in secrets. I heard Whitaker's got himself a girl out at that ranch, he drawled. Young thing, pretty too. Shame she ain't his wife. The men laughed, but Jace's smile didn't reach his eyes. A woman like that, she doesn't forget who gave her the first taste of adventure. By morning, the whispers had already reached every corner of town. When Thomas rode into Abilene for supplies, he felt the change immediately. The glances were sharper, the laughter quieter when he passed. He ignored it, as he always did, until he reached the blacksmith's shop and heard Jace's voice nearby. Well, if it isn't the righteous Mr. Whitaker, Jace said with mock cheer, stepping out of the shade. You always did have a way of rescuing lost souls. Tell me, how's my Maggie these days? Thomas's hands tightened on the reins. She isn't yours, and you'll stay away from her, Jace laughed. Oh, I think she still remembers me. Women like her don't forget so easily. You forfeited your right to speak her name the day you left her, Thomas said coldly. Jace's grin faltered for a fraction of a second. Careful, Whitaker. You wouldn't want the town thinking you've been keeping another man's woman under your roof. Thomas dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate force. You'll keep her name out of your mouth, and if you value your teeth, you'll keep your distance. Jace's smirk returned, though his eyes flashed with anger. Touchy, aren't we? Seems I've struck something tender. Thomas didn't answer. He simply stared him down until the gambler's confidence began to crack. Then he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Jace with his laughter echoing emptily behind him. By the time Thomas returned to the ranch, dusk had fallen. Maggie was waiting on the porch, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. You saw him, she said. Yes. What did he want? Trouble. She looked down, her voice trembling. He'll try to hurt you, Thomas. He'll use lies. He'll twist them until they sound like truth. I've lived long enough to know the difference, he replied gently. Let him talk. Let him lie. It changes nothing about who you are. Her eyes filled again, and she turned away, ashamed of her tears. I brought this on you. No, he said firmly. He did. You don't carry his sins. The quiet between them grew thick, filled with everything neither dared to confess. Then in a rare act of courage, Maggie reached out and touched his sleeve. Her hand trembled against the coarse fabric. Why do you do this for me? She asked. You owe me nothing. Thomas looked down at her, his voice low and steady. I owe you honesty. And the truth is I can't stand the thought of that man ever making you afraid again. Her lips parted, but no words came. The storm inside her heart broke quietly, without thunder, without tears, only the shattering realization that she had begun to love him. That night, as rain began to fall again across the plains, she sat by the fire mending one of his shirts. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, and her hands lingered on the collar longer than they should have. She could hear him pacing outside on the porch, the sound of his boots steady against the wood, a silent vow that she was not alone. When he finally stepped back inside, dripping from the rain, she rose to hand him the mended shirt. "It's finished," she said softly. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief, but it sent a spark through the air, quiet, potent, impossible to ignore. "Thank you," he murmured. Their eyes met, and for the first time neither looked away. Maggie's voice trembled. "Thomas, yes, if I could go back, if I could change the choices I made, I would never have trusted him. I would have waited for someone kinder." He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "You didn't deserve what he did, none of it." Her gaze searched his face. "And yet I found something better in what came after." He reached up, brushing a damp curl from her cheek with a tenderness that almost undid him. "You should rest," he whispered. But she didn't move. The firelight flickered between them, warm and golden, painting her face with a glow that made his restraint feel like agony. For a heartbeat, the air was full of everything they wanted to say, but couldn't. Then slowly he stepped back, his voice rough. "Good night, Maggie. Good night, Thomas." When he left the room, the warmth of his touch lingered against her skin. Outside, the rain softened into a whisper against the roof, carrying with it a truth neither dared speak aloud, that love, once awakened, could never again be silenced, no matter how deep the shadows of the past. The sun rose pale and unforgiving over Abilene, its light falling upon a town already murmuring with talk. In the mercantile, in the saloon, on the church steps, voices low and sharp spread rumors like wildfire. The gambler's visit had been brief, but the poison of his words remained. By the time the morning bells rang, everyone seemed to know that Thomas Whitaker was harboring a young woman of questionable virtue, and that the child she carried was his. At the ranch, the day began as all others, quiet except for the hum of cicadas and the soft clang of a pail against the well. Maggie moved carefully through her chores, her back aching, her steps slower now as her body grew heavy with the child. Yet she carried herself with dignity, unaware of the stories already circling like vultures above her head. Silas was the first to bring word. He rode back from town near noon, his hat in his hands and an anger in his eyes that he rarely let show. "They've turned it into scandal," he said, standing in the shade of the porch where Thomas leaned against a post. "Mrs. Briggs, the church ladies, even the men at the feed store, they're saying you took her in for more than charity." Thomas's expression remained calm, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. "They've always needed something to talk about. Let them tire themselves out." "This won't blow over," Silas warned. "Mallory's been whispering, twisting things. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you paid him to keep quiet about her. He wants money, Thomas, or he'll drag her name through the mud completely." Thomas's voice dropped to a low growl. "He's already done that." Silas nodded grimly. "And he's enjoying it." For a long moment neither man spoke. The sound of wind against the dry grass was the only witness to the fury Thomas kept contained. Then, without another word, he went inside. Maggie was standing near the window, folding freshly washed linens. The sunlight framed her in soft gold, catching the fine tendrils of hair that had escaped her braid. When she saw his face, she froze. "What's wrong?" she asked. He hesitated, unwilling to wound her with the truth, yet unable to lie. "There's talk in town. Mallory's been spreading filth again." She paled, setting the linens aside. "What has he said?" "That the child is mine." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp as a blade. Maggie's lips parted, her eyes wide with disbelief. No, they wouldn't." "They would," Thomas said quietly. "And they have." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "Then I should leave, tonight, before it gets worse." "You'll do no such thing." His tone was firm, almost harsh, but his eyes softened as he stepped closer. "You think leaving will silence them?" It will only give them reason to believe what he says. But you'll lose everything because of me, she whispered. Your reputation, your business, I can rebuild those, he interrupted. I can't rebuild my conscience if I abandon you now. Her eyes filled with tears. You shouldn't have to carry the weight of my mistakes. They're not your mistakes, he said, his voice low, almost tender. They're his lies. She wanted to believe him, but shame was an old companion. It clung to her like dust. She turned away, pressing a trembling hand to the window pane. People will never let me forget who I was. Thomas took a slow step toward her. Then let them learn who you are now. When she looked at him, her heart stuttered. His gaze held no pity, no condescension, only quiet strength, the kind that steadied her even as it undid her. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe again. By evening, the sky had turned to copper, and the air carried the weight of thunder that would not fall. Thomas saddled his horse, saying only that he needed to go into town. Maggie stood on the porch, her hands folded over her stomach, fear tightening her chest. Please, she said softly, don't confront him. That's what he wants. Thomas paused, meeting her gaze. Some things can't be left to rot in silence. I won't let him destroy what little peace we've found. She wanted to stop him, but the quiet authority in his voice silenced her protest. He tipped his hat, then rode out into the fading light. In town, the saloon was alive with noise, laughter, music, the smell of tobacco and sweat thick in the air. Jace Mallory sat at the poker table, a glass of whiskey in hand, the picture of charm and corruption. When Thomas entered, the room fell into a hush. Well, if it isn't the noble Mr. Whitaker, Jace drawled, his grin slow and mocking. Come to join the game, or to buy your reputation back? I came to warn you, Thomas said evenly. You'll keep her name out of your mouth. Jace leaned back in his chair. Now that's funny. The way people tell it, she's already yours. I'm just setting the story straight. Thomas stepped closer, his voice deadly calm. You left her to starve. You threw her away like she was nothing. But she's not nothing, not anymore. Ah, Jace said with a smirk. So it's true then. You've made her yours. In one swift motion, Thomas grabbed him by the collar and hauled him to his feet. The noise of the room vanished into silence. You will not speak of her again, Thomas hissed. If you so much as look her way, I'll make sure you regret it. Jace's smile faltered for a heartbeat before he forced it back. Careful, Whitaker. A man like me doesn't take kindly to threats. I don't make threats, Thomas said, only promises. He released him and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. Behind him, the gambler's laughter rose again, but there was a crack in it now, something brittle and false. When Thomas returned to the ranch, the night had settled deep and heavy. Maggie was waiting, sitting near the hearth, with her sewing untouched in her lap. She rose as soon as she saw him. Did he? He won't trouble you again, Thomas said, his voice quiet but resolute. She wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was something raw there, something she didn't dare name. Thank you, she said instead, her voice trembling, for standing up for me. He shook his head. Don't thank me. You didn't ask for this. No, she whispered, but you chose to fight for me anyway. The space between them seemed to hum with unspoken feeling. Thomas's gaze lingered on her face, the soft curve of her cheek illuminated by the firelight. I'd do it again, he said quietly. 1,000 times. Maggie's throat tightened. She'd spent months trying to be invisible, to earn her place through silence and service. Yet here he was, seeing her, defending her, choosing her. It was more dangerous than any gossip could ever be, because it made her heart hope. Outside, lightning flashed faintly over the distant hills. Thomas crossed the room and poured her a glass of water, his hand brushing hers as he passed it to her. The touch was brief, but it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. You're shaking, he murmured. I'm fine, she said, though her voice betrayed her. He stepped closer, his voice low, his presence overwhelming. You don't have to pretend with me, Maggie, not here. Her eyes met his, and something inside her broke. I'm afraid, she admitted, not of him, of what this will cost you." Thomas's expression softened. "Some things are worth the cost." The silence that followed was heavy with longing, filled with the crackle of the fire and the soft rhythm of their breathing. Neither moved, and yet the distance between them seemed to disappear. Maggie lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushed. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because they sound too much like promises," she whispered. His voice grew rough. "Maybe they are." For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The faint scent of rain in her hair, the flicker of the fire reflected in his eyes, the quiet thunder of hearts refusing to obey reason. Then, as though the spell might shatter if held too long, he stepped back. "You should rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow will be better." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that morning could wash away the lies of men and the cruelty of gossip. But as she watched him walk toward the door, she knew that the world beyond these walls would not forgive easily. Still, for that one night, in the quiet refuge of the ranch, she let herself imagine a different kind of future. A life not built on survival or shame, but on the quiet strength of a man who had chosen to stand beside her when the world turned against them both. As the storm broke outside, rain tapping softly against the windows, Maggie lay awake, listening for his footsteps in the hall. And though she could not see him, she knew he was there, awake, watchful, keeping his silent promise that no scandal, no man, and no lie would ever touch her again. The evening settled heavy and breathless over the plains, the kind of quiet that comes before the world breaks open. The wind had died, the sky turning a sickly shade of grey-green, and the air felt so still that even the horses shifted uneasily in their stalls. Thomas stood on the porch, hat in hand, watching the dark horizon where lightning flickered far beyond the hills. He could smell the rain coming, the sharp tang of it carried faintly on the wind. Inside the house, Maggie moved slowly through her nightly tasks, her steps careful and measured. Her back ached, her breathing shallow. For weeks, she had ignored the tightening in her belly, telling herself it was too soon. But tonight, something was different. The pain came like a wave and then vanished, leaving her trembling. She paused at the table, gripping its edge until the world steadied again. When Thomas entered, shaking the dust from his coat, he saw at once that her face was pale. "You're not well," he said, crossing to her side. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice trembled. "It's only the heat." He looked at her closely, his brow furrowing. "It's not the heat, is it?" Another pain gripped her, stronger this time. Her hand flew to her abdomen, and she drew in a sharp breath. "No," she whispered, "it's time." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still around them. Then Thomas sprang into motion. "Sit down," he said, steady and calm, though his heart was pounding. "Silas went into town this morning. He'll fetch the doctor if the roads hold." "But there's no time for that," she said, her voice taut with fear. "He'll never make it back in this storm." Outside, the first roll of thunder shook the air. The wind rose suddenly, slamming the shutters against the walls. Rain began to fall in fierce, uneven drops, drumming against the roof like gunfire. Thomas guided her toward the bed in the downstairs room, his hands firm but gentle. "You'll stay here. I'll do what I can." She clutched his sleeve, her eyes wide. "You've done enough already." "I haven't," he said quietly. "Not yet." The storm gathered its fury. Lightning split the sky, and the sound of thunder followed, rattling the windows. Thomas moved through the house, lighting lamps, the glow flickering over the wooden walls. He found clean towels, a basin and blankets, his movements steady even as worry twisted deep in his chest. When he returned to her side, she was lying back against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat. She tried to speak, but another pain took her, and her breath came in ragged gasps. "Breathe, Maggie," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "You've survived worse storms than this." She managed a faint, trembling smile. "Not one like this." He took her hand, his thumb brushing against her palm. "You'll not face it alone." The wind howled outside, tearing through the branches, making the house groan. The smell of wet earth seeped through the cracks, mingling with the scent of oil and wood smoke. Inside, time seemed to slow. There was only the sound of the storm and Maggie's labored breathing. Hours passed in fragments, thunder, silence, pain, and the soft, reassuring cadence of his voice. He wiped her brow, fetched water, steadied her when she cried out, and when she was too weak to speak, he held her hand tightly so she would know she was not alone. "Thomas," she whispered once, when the pain subsided for a brief moment. "Yes?" Her eyes fluttered open, the faintest light of the lamp reflected in them. "Do you think God forgives the lost?" His voice was rough. "If he doesn't, then what hope is left for the rest of us?" She smiled weakly, tears shining on her lashes. "Then maybe he'll forgive me too." "There's nothing to forgive," he said. "You've done nothing but survive." Another wave came and she gripped his hand until he felt her nails bite into his skin. He said nothing, only leaned close, whispering words he could barely think through his own fear. "You're strong, Maggie. You've fought through worse. You can do this." Her cry broke through the roar of thunder. The storm raged, the rain fell harder, and still she labored. The hours stretched endlessly, but Thomas never left her side. When the worst of it came, she clung to him, her forehead against his shoulder, her breath hot against his neck. And then, at last, the storm outside began to ease. The thunder drifted into the distance, the rain softened into a whisper, and in the dim glow of the lamp a new sound filled the air, a thin, uncertain cry that seemed to split the silence in two. Maggie fell back against the pillows, her face pale but radiant, her tears mingling with sweat. Thomas stood frozen for a heartbeat, his breath catching in his throat. Then he looked down at the small, wriggling life in his hands. The child was tiny, impossibly fragile, her skin flushed pink from the effort of entering the world. She opened her mouth and cried again, her voice piercing and alive. Thomas stared, wonder and disbelief mingling in his expression. "It's a girl," he said softly. Maggie's eyes fluttered open. "A girl?" He nodded, his voice thick. "A strong one." She smiled faintly, exhaustion pulling at her, but peace softening her face. May she never have to be as strong as her mother. Thomas placed the baby gently in her arms, and for a moment the storm seemed far away. Maggie looked down at the child, her hands trembling as she traced a finger across her daughter's cheek. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "She looks like you," he said, kneeling beside the bed. "No," she murmured. "She looks like Mercy." For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft cooing of the baby and the gentle patter of rain. The world outside had been washed clean, the scent of wet earth drifting through the open window. When the baby fell asleep, Maggie turned her gaze to Thomas. The firelight played across his face, revealing a weariness that went deeper than the night's work. She wanted to thank him, to tell him that his presence had been her anchor through the storm, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing his. "You stayed," she whispered. "I said I would." "You should rest," she said softly. "You've done more than anyone could ask." He shook his head. "I couldn't sleep, even if I tried." She studied him quietly, the shadows of the room deepening around them. "You've been alone for so long," she said. "You don't have to be anymore." Her words struck something deep within him, something he had spent years keeping buried. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "I don't deserve the peace you bring into this house," he said. "Peace doesn't belong to those who deserve it," she answered. "It comes to those who need it most." Her hand was still in his, small and warm. He lifted it to his lips, hesitating only for a moment before pressing a kiss against her knuckles. The gesture was reverent, wordless, full of everything he couldn't say aloud. She closed her eyes, the faintest smile touching her lips. "You'll be a good man to her," she murmured, half asleep. "To both of us." He sat there long after she drifted into slumber, the lamp flickering beside them. The baby slept against her mother's chest, her tiny breaths syncing with the rhythm of the rain. Thomas watched them, his heart aching with something he had never known before, a love that asked for nothing, yet gave everything. Outside, dawn began to break. The sky lightened from grey to gold, and the first rays of sunlight spilled over the wet fields, glistening on every blade of grass. The world looked reborn. Thomas rose quietly, pulling a blanket over Maggie's shoulders. He moved to the window and looked out at the land he had worked and fought to keep. It had weathered storms, endured drought, and still stood firm. For the first time, he understood what it meant to build something worth protecting. Not a ranch, not a name, but a life. When he turned back, Maggie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Thomas?" He smiled faintly. "You're safe," he said. "Both of you." Her voice was weak, but certain. "I knew we would be." He knelt beside her again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known." She reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. "You gave me courage, Thomas. You gave me a reason to believe in kindness again." The morning light touched them both, soft and forgiving. For a long moment, neither spoke. Their eyes said everything, the gratitude, the tenderness, the unspoken truth that their hearts had already found what words could not name. And as the sun rose higher over Abilene, the ranch stood quiet once more, a sanctuary in a world that had so often been cruel. Inside, beneath the gentle light of a new day, 3 lives rested together: the woman who had survived the storm, the man who had guided her through it, and the child whose first breath had broken the silence of 2 wounded hearts, forever changing the course of both. Morning came softly to the Whitaker ranch, with a sky the color of pale rose and mist curling over the pastures like a whispered secret. The world looked clean again, washed by the storm that had raged through the night before. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke, and in the kitchen, the faint crackle of the hearth mingled with the gentle rhythm of a newborn's breath. Maggie lay propped against the pillows, her face still pale but calm, her eyes fixed on the small bundle sleeping in her arms. The child's tiny fingers curled around the fabric of her mother's dress, and each breath she took felt like a miracle. Maggie could not look away. She had not yet named her daughter, names she thought should be spoken with certainty, not in haste. For now, it was enough to know that she lived. When Thomas stepped into the room, the light caught his face in soft gold. He looked older somehow, the sleepless night written in the faint shadows under his eyes, but there was a peace in his expression she had not seen before. He paused at the door, hat in hand, unwilling to break the quiet. "She's beautiful," he said finally, his voice low. Maggie smiled faintly, her eyes still on the child. "I keep thinking she'll vanish if I look away, like something I dreamt and forgot to hold on to. She's real," he said gently, walking closer. "And she's strong, just like her mother." Her cheeks warmed at the words. "You stayed through the night. I told you I would." He knelt beside her, resting a hand on the edge of the bed. The sight of her there, fragile yet radiant, her hair unbound, her gaze tender, stirred something in him that was both awe and ache. She had brought life into a world that had only ever taken from her, and he found himself humbled by her courage. Maggie studied him quietly, noticing how his usually firm posture seemed softer now, how his eyes carried an emotion he rarely allowed to show. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has," she said. Thomas shook his head. "You've done it yourself. I only made sure you didn't have to do it alone." Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them seemed to still. There was no need for words. The silence itself felt alive, filled with the warmth of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper neither dared to name. But peace was a fragile visitor in Abilene. Before the sun had reached its peak, a knock came at the door. It was Silas, his hat damp from the wet grass, his face drawn. "Boss," he said quietly, glancing toward Maggie. "You'd better come outside." Thomas stepped into the yard, closing the door behind him. The sky had turned clear and sharp, but the light felt harsher now. A small crowd was gathered near the fence line, Men from town, women in stiff collars, their expressions tight and self-righteous. At the front stood Mrs. Briggs, her gloved hands folded neatly, her mouth pressed into a line of judgment. "I wondered how long it would take," Thomas said calmly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We've come for the truth," Mrs. Briggs replied, her voice crisp as winter air. "The town's been whispering, Mr. Whitaker, and decent folk have a right to know what kind of household you're running." Thomas's jaw tensed. "You came all this way to gossip? To protect the moral standing of Abilene," she said. "That girl of yours, she gave birth under your roof, didn't she?" "She's not my girl," he said sharply. "She's a woman under my protection. And yes, she had a child here, a child who's done nothing to deserve your malice." A murmur ran through the crowd. One of the men, Mr. Alden from the feed store, stepped forward. "People are saying the child's yours, Whitaker, that you've been hiding behind decency while breaking the very laws of it." Thomas's expression did not falter. "People say many things when they've nothing else to fill their days, but lies don't become truth just because they're repeated." "And if it is true?" Mrs. Briggs demanded. "If you've brought sin into this community, we have every right to know." Thomas looked over the faces before him, the same men and women he'd done business with, shared church pews with, trusted for years. He felt something inside him harden. "You think sin lives in a child, in a woman who's done nothing but survive? Then perhaps you ought to look closer at your own hearts before you call yourselves righteous." The words landed like stones. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but Mrs. Briggs did not relent. "So you'll protect her, no matter what people think?" "Yes," he said simply. "I will." At that moment, the door opened behind him. Maggie stood in the doorway, pale and trembling, but defiant, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the baby cradled against her chest. The murmuring ceased. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Go back inside," Thomas said softly, turning to her. "No," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "I won't hide." She stepped forward, the hem of her gown brushing the damp grass. The child stirred in her arms, her small cry breaking the uneasy quiet. Maggie faced the crowd, her chin lifted. "You don't need to whisper," she said, her voice clear. "I know what you think of me. You've thought it since the day I came here." Mrs. Briggs sniffed. "Then you should have stayed where you belonged." "And where is that?" Maggie asked, her tone calm but unyielding. "On the street? In a ditch? Do you think a woman like me deserves no place to stand simply because she trusted the wrong man?" No one answered. The baby whimpered again, and Maggie rocked her gently. "You can say what you like about me," she continued, her gaze sweeping across them, "but this child will not grow up hearing shame in her mother's name, not while I have breath left to speak it." Thomas stepped closer, his presence solid beside her. He turned to the crowd, his voice low but carrying with quiet power. "You heard her. You'll not bring your hatred to this house again. If you have any quarrel, take it to me, but leave her out of it." Mrs. Briggs opened her mouth to reply, but one of the men, the blacksmith, Mr. Pritchard, spoke first. "That's enough, Lenora. Let the woman be. We've got no right to pass judgment." Several others nodded, muttering agreement. The tide had shifted, if only slightly. Mrs. Briggs huffed, gathering her shawl tighter. "We'll see how long your charity lasts, Mr. Whitaker. A man's reputation is easier lost than kept." Thomas's reply was steady. "Then it's a good thing I value decency more than reputation." She gave him one final glare before turning sharply and leading the others away. The crowd dispersed slowly, their whispers fading into the wind. When they were gone, the silence that followed was almost overwhelming. Maggie swayed where she stood, her strength spent. Thomas reached her just as her knees began to give. "I told you not to come out," he said softly, holding her steady. "I had to," she murmured. "I couldn't let them speak for me." "You shouldn't have had to," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Inside, he helped her to the chair near the fire. The baby stirred and began to cry softly, and Maggie soothed her with gentle murmurs. Thomas knelt before her, his hand resting on the arm of the chair. "You shouldn't have faced them alone," he said quietly, "but you did it with more courage than any man I know." Her eyes lifted to his, shimmering with exhaustion and quiet pride. "I wasn't alone," she whispered. "You were there." He exhaled slowly, the truth of her words settling deep inside him. The tension that had bound him for months seemed to ease, replaced by something stronger, something he could no longer deny. "Maggie," he said, her name soft and reverent on his lips. "What they say doesn't matter, not to me." Her voice trembled. "It will to others. Let them talk. Let them fill the air with lies. I'll drown them out with truth if I have to." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "And what truth is that, Thomas? That you and that child are the best things that have ever come into my life," he said. "And I won't let anyone take that from me." For a long moment, neither moved. The fire crackled softly, the baby's breathing quieted, and outside the wind sighed against the walls. Maggie's hand reached out, hesitated, then found his, their fingers intertwined, the contact tender and sure. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered, though hope trembled beneath her words. "Yes, I do," he said simply. "For the first time in years, I do." Her eyes closed, a tear slipping down her cheek. When she spoke again, her voice was a whisper. "Then maybe there's still mercy left in this world after all." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her skin, the gesture full of quiet devotion. "There's mercy," he said, "and there's love. Sometimes they're the same thing." As night fell over the ranch, the world outside seemed distant and small. Inside, the light from the fire bathed them in gold, soft and forgiving. The wind that once carried whispers now sang through the eaves like a lullaby. Maggie leaned back in the chair, her child safe in her arms, and Thomas watched over them both with a heart that finally knew its purpose. Not as a man protecting a stranger, but as someone who had found his home at last, in the quiet strength of a woman who had faced the world and refused to bow before it. The first chill of autumn crept across the plains, soft and steady, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The fields around the Whitaker ranch had begun to fade, from green to gold, and the days grew shorter, the light gentler. It was a quiet season, one of endings and beginnings, of things laid to rest and others waiting to bloom again. Maggie sat by the window that morning, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, the baby asleep in a cradle beside her. The leaves danced outside, catching the wind like flecks of fire, and she watched them fall with a thoughtful stillness. Since the day she had stood against the townspeople, something inside her had changed. The fear that had once ruled her life no longer felt like a master she had to obey. She was not invisible anymore. She had been seen, and she had survived it. Yet even peace came with its own quiet ache. She could not stop thinking of Thomas, of the way he had spoken to her before the fire that night, his words trembling with truth. She remembered the warmth in his voice, the conviction in his eyes, the way he had said love as though it were not a word, but a vow. And though he had not spoken of it since, the memory lingered, living between them like a breath that never faded. Outside, she heard his voice calling to the horses, low and calm. She turned her gaze toward the yard. He was standing near the fence, his sleeves rolled up, his movements strong and sure. The morning light touched his face, softening the lines of age and solitude. Watching him, Maggie felt the strange flutter of both safety and longing, feelings that both comforted and frightened her. When he came inside a while later, brushing the dust from his hands, she smiled faintly. "The weather's changing," she said. He nodded. "It'll be a cold winter." "I don't mind the cold," she replied softly. "It feels honest." He looked at her then, really looked, as though searching her words for something deeper. "Honest," he repeated. "I suppose that's rare enough to appreciate." She glanced toward the cradle. "The baby doesn't have a name yet," she said. "I've thought of so many, but none seem to fit." Thomas stepped closer, his voice gentle. "Maybe it's not for you to choose. Maybe when she opens her eyes and truly sees you, She'll tell you herself." Maggie smiled, her gaze turning tenderly to her daughter. "You make everything sound so simple." "It isn't simple," he said, almost to himself. "It's just worth the trouble." Before she could reply, Silas entered through the back door, his hat in his hands and a letter clutched in his fingers. "This came from town," he said, handing it to Thomas. "Delivered by that clerk from the post." Thomas frowned, breaking the wax seal. He read the first lines, and his jaw tightened. Maggie noticed the shift in his expression immediately. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, folding the paper carefully. "It's from Mallory." Her heart stilled. "He wrote to you?" "He's leaving Abilene," Thomas said quietly, "heading west to California. Says he wants to make amends before he goes." Maggie's voice trembled. "Amends? After all he's done?" Thomas's gaze softened. "Sometimes a man finds the end of his road and realizes what he's lost along the way." "I don't want his words," she said, bitterness flashing through her voice. "He already took enough from me." Thomas looked down at the letter. He sent something else. He reached into the envelope and drew out a folded piece of paper. Faded, the edges worn. He handed it to her. She opened it slowly. It was a photograph, small and grainy, the kind taken at a traveling fair. She gasped softly. It was of her, years younger, her smile shy but bright. She remembered the day it was taken. Jace had insisted on it, saying he wanted to remember her face when he struck it rich. She had believed him then. The memory twisted something deep inside her. She pressed the photo to her chest, her eyes closing. Why would he send this? Thomas's voice was steady. "Maybe he knew you'd forgotten how to see yourself as you were before the pain. Maybe he wanted to remind you that you were once happy and that you could be again." Tears welled in her eyes. "You always find mercy in people who don't deserve it." He shook his head. "It isn't mercy. It's choice. You can't let him take one more thing from you, Maggie, not even your forgiveness." She looked up at him then, her heart breaking with gratitude and something dangerously close to love. "You make it sound so easy to forgive." "It's never easy," he said. "But it's the only thing that lets the hurt stop owning you." She held his gaze for a long moment, then set the photo aside, her fingers brushing his as she did. The touch lingered, electric, full of unsaid things. The rest of the morning passed in quiet work. Thomas fixed the fence, Silas tended the horses, and Maggie moved through the house with a serenity that belied the storm inside her. When evening fell, she lit the lamps and watched the glow spill across the wooden floors, turning the small home into something warm and sacred. After supper, she found Thomas on the porch, staring out toward the open plains. The stars were just beginning to appear, one by one, scattered across the velvet dark. The wind had stilled, leaving only the faint rustle of the wheat in the fields. "You've been quiet tonight," she said softly. He turned slightly, offering her a faint smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how life has a way of finding you, even when you've stopped looking for it." She stepped beside him, her shawl fluttering lightly in the breeze. "And when it does, you learn to be brave enough to hold on." Their eyes met, and in that moment it felt as though the whole world had narrowed to the space between them. The faint scent of her hair, the steady rhythm of his breath, the warmth radiating from where their hands nearly touched. "Thomas," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I don't know what I'd have done without you." "You'd have survived," he said simply. "You always do." She smiled faintly. "That isn't the same as living." He looked at her then, his gaze deep and unwavering. "Then maybe it's time you started." Her breath caught, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then slowly she reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. He turned his palm upward, letting her fingers slip into his. The contact was soft, but certain, a promise made in silence. "Maggie," he whispered, her name a prayer. "You don't owe me gratitude. You don't owe me anything." She shook her head. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd find again. A home. A chance to be someone other than the girl who was left behind. "You were never that girl," he said. "You were always the woman who stood up and kept walking." Tears glimmered in her eyes and she looked away, afraid that if she spoke, she would lose the fragile strength she had left. "Sometimes I think God sent me here to break your peace," she murmured. Thomas smiled faintly. "You didn't break it. You gave it a reason to exist." The wind stirred again, carrying the soft scent of sage and rain. In the distance, a coyote called, its cry echoing across the land. Maggie leaned against the railing, her shoulder brushing his. "I never told you," she said quietly. "When I first arrived, I prayed every night for a way to start over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, but then I found this place, you, and I realized I hadn't been abandoned. I'd been guided." Thomas's throat tightened. Maybe we both were. And they stood there for a long time, watching the stars bloom above the dark horizon. The baby's soft cry drifted from inside, and Maggie turned, her shawl slipping slightly from her shoulders. Thomas caught it, his hand steady as he placed it back around her. His fingers lingered just a moment longer than propriety allowed. Their eyes met once more, his full of quiet devotion, hers full of a love she could no longer hide. "Thomas," she whispered, "I don't know what the world will say if I stay here." He took a slow breath, his gaze unwavering. "Let them say what they want. You've already faced them once and won. The rest of it doesn't matter. It matters to you," she said gently. "You've worked your whole life to build a name that's respected." He shook his head. "A name means nothing if there's no one to share it with." For a heartbeat she stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The world seemed to hush, the night holding its breath. Then she reached out, her hand finding his again. "If I stay," she said softly, "I want it to be because it's what you want, not what the world allows." His voice was rough, unguarded. "I want you here, more than I've wanted anything in my life." The words hung between them like a vow, quiet and eternal. She didn't answer, but the way her hand tightened around his told him all he needed to know. The baby cried again, and Maggie turned toward the door. She looked back once, her eyes shimmering in the lamplight. "Good night, Thomas." He watched her go, his heart full and aching. "Good night, Maggie," he said softly, though she was already beyond hearing. When the door closed, he leaned against the railing, gazing up at the vast sky. The stars stretched endlessly, bright and unyielding, and for the first time in years he felt that the world was not as cruel as it once had seemed. Somewhere between the ruin of the past and the fragile beauty of the present, he had found something worth keeping, a letter that closed old wounds, a promise that healed new ones, and a love born quietly beneath the Texas stars. The first frost came quietly, like a secret laid upon the earth. It silvered the fence posts and softened the fields into something almost gentle, as if the land itself had decided to grow tender after so much hardness. In the mornings, Maggie could see her breath when she stepped onto the porch, the pale cloud of it drifting into the cold air before dissolving into the wide silence. Inside the house, warmth gathered where it mattered most. The hearth burned steady. The kettle sang. And in the cradle near the fire, the baby stirred with a soft, sleepy sound that made Maggie's heart turn over every time, as if it were still surprised by the miracle of her. Thomas had taken to that cradle as though it belonged to him by some ancient right. He never claimed her with words, never spoke in grand declarations in front of others, but his actions were louder than sermons. He checked the blanket when he thought Maggie wasn't looking. He warmed the milk. He stood at the window at night with the quiet vigilance of a man guarding a sacred thing. Yet peace had its enemies, and Abilene had never been a town that let happiness grow without trying to trample it first. It began with paper. A letter arrived in Silas's hands, then another, and then another. Clean envelopes with sharp handwriting, bearing the scent of town offices and men who smiled politely while sharpening knives behind their backs. Thomas read them at the kitchen table, his face composed, his shoulders steady, but Maggie saw the truth in the way his thumb pressed hard against the edges, in the way his jaw tightened as if he were holding something down. "What is it?" she asked one morning, when the baby finally slept and the house fell still enough for fear to speak. Thomas folded the letter carefully. "Merchants are refusing me credit." Maggie's breath caught. "Because of me." "No," he said at once, too firm, too quick. "Because of themselves." She stared at him, her hands tightening around the mug of tea. The warmth of it seeped into her palms, but it did not reach her chest. "Thomas, I know what they whisper. They think they can punish you until you set me outside like a stray dog." His eyes lifted to hers, and she felt the full weight of him then, how much he carried without complaint, how much he had chosen without asking anyone's permission. "They can try," he said quietly. "But I won't barter a person's dignity for flour and nails." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they made her throat burn. "You shouldn't lose what you've built." His voice softened, and the room seemed to soften with it. "What I built was walls," he said. "You brought life into this house. You brought warmth. You brought something worth more than any contract." Maggie looked down, blinking hard. "I never wanted to be your ruin." Thomas rose from the table and crossed the kitchen slowly, as if careful movement could keep the world from breaking. He stopped close enough that she felt his presence like heat. "You aren't my ruin," he said. "You're my reason." The baby let out a small sigh in her sleep, a sound so innocent it felt like a blessing. Maggie's eyes closed for a moment, and when she opened them, she found Thomas still watching her, as if he'd been watching her all along and only now allowed her to see it. But outside their walls, trouble had not finished circling. Silas returned from the pastures one late afternoon with a look that turned the air sharp. He held something in his hand, a small piece of leather, worn and stained, with a brass rivet stamped with a maker's mark. "I found it near the back fence," Silas said quietly, his voice tight with anger. "Same place where the prince used to show up months back." Thomas took it, turning it in his hands. His gaze hardened. "This isn't from any of our tack." Silas nodded. "No, it's from town. I asked the saddler without giving him the whole story. He said he sold a strap like that to Mallory's friend, the one who rides with him when he wants folks to think he's got teeth." Maggie felt her blood drain. "The rider," she whispered, the memory rising like a cold hand against her spine. Thomas looked at her at once. "You saw him that night. You were right to be afraid." "I thought I was imagining it," she said, her voice thin. "I thought fear was just following me like a shadow." Thomas's gaze turned darker, not at her, but for her. "You weren't imagining anything." Silas leaned against the counter, his fingers curling into a fist. "There's more. That letter Mallory sent, about leaving for California. It was meant to soothe you, make you think he'd disappear with a clean conscience." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" Silas's voice dropped. "He isn't leaving clean. He's trying to leave unpunished." Maggie's stomach twisted. She held the edge of the table, steadying herself as if the floor had begun to tilt. "He wouldn't dare come back here." "He doesn't have to," Silas said. "He can do damage without showing his face. He can whisper to merchants. He can send men to cut lines. He can stir a town until it believes its own lies." Thomas stared down at the leather strap, as if it were a confession. Then he folded it into his palm and looked at Silas. "Saddle up." Maggie's head snapped up. "Thomas, no." He turned to her, and the firmness in him softened just enough to show what it cost. "I won't ride into town to start a fight," he said. "I'll ride into town to end one." Fear and love rose together in Maggie's chest, tangled so tightly she could barely breathe. "Then I'm coming." Thomas took a slow step toward her. "You shouldn't." "I won't hide," she said, the words steady, even when her hand shook. "Not anymore." The baby stirred at the sound of their voices, and Maggie hesitated, torn between her child and the fire she was walking toward. Silas's gaze softened. "I'll stay," he said. "I'll watch her, like she's my own blood." Maggie swallowed hard and nodded. She wrapped her shawl tight, lifted her chin, and followed Thomas out into the cold evening air. Town lights glowed like distant embers. When they arrived, the streets were busy with men leaving the saloon, collars turned up against the growing chill. The sound of laughter floated out of open doors, harsh and careless. It was the kind of laughter that had once made Maggie feel small. Not tonight. Thomas led her toward the sheriff's office, his hand hovering near her back, not touching but close enough that she felt the protection of it, like a prayer. Inside, the sheriff looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face when he saw Maggie's pale resolve. "What can I do for you, Whitaker?" he asked. Thomas placed the leather strap on the desk. "Mallory's been stalking my property, months. I have reason to believe he's been trying to ruin my business to force me into paying him." The sheriff squinted down at the strap, then looked back up. "That's a serious claim." "It's a serious man," Thomas said, voice low. "He doesn't do anything unless he can profit from it." Maggie's voice rose then, quiet but clear. "He abandoned me," she said. "And when he returned, he tried to make my shame into his coin. He wants to leave town without consequence. I'm asking you not to let him." The sheriff's eyes lingered on her for a moment, as if seeing her properly for the first time, not as a rumor but as a woman with a backbone made of steel. He exhaled slowly. "I'll send a deputy to fetch him," he said. "But I'll need more than a strap." Thomas nodded once, as if he'd expected this. "You'll have it?" They didn't have to wait long. A deputy returned within the hour, escorting Jace Mallory through the door with a hand firm on his shoulder. Jace wore a tailored vest and polished boots, as if clothing could disguise the rot beneath his charm. His eyes flicked to Maggie, and for a moment his smile tried to return, thin, practiced, cruel. "Maggie," he said softly, as if tasting her name. "You look settled." Thomas took one step forward, and the smile died in Jace's throat. "Don't," Thomas said quietly. Jace lifted his hands in mock innocence. "I only came to make peace." Maggie's voice did not tremble. "Peace isn't yours to offer." His gaze sharpened. "You wouldn't have survived without me. If I hadn't taken you from that dull little life." "You didn't take me," she said, every word steady. "You used me, and then you ran." Jace's jaw tightened. "Be careful, Maggie. A woman alone with a child—" "She isn't alone," Thomas cut in, his tone calm enough to be terrifying. "And she never will be again." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mallory, Whitaker's accusing you of harassment, intimidation, and attempted extortion." Jace scoffed. "Extortion? That's a big word for a simple conversation." Thomas reached into his coat and placed something else on the desk, a small folded paper, stamped and signed. "The saddler's mark matches that strap. And the saddler gave a statement that it was sold to your companion." Jace's eyes flashed. "That proves nothing." Maggie stepped forward, her shawl pulled tight, her chin lifted like a blade. "It proves you were there," she said. "And if you were there, you can answer why." Jace's gaze flickered, and for the first time real uncertainty cracked his polished surface. He leaned toward her, voice lowering, trying to pull her into private fear. "You want to ruin me? After everything?" Maggie's eyes shone, not with weakness, but with something harder. Freedom. "You ruined yourself," she whispered. "I only stopped carrying your shame." Thomas's hand found hers then, finally fully, fingers curling around her palm with steady warmth. It was not a display. It was a truth. The sheriff watched that handhold, watched the way Maggie's spine straightened under it, watched the way Thomas didn't flinch from being seen. Then he nodded once, as if something had settled in his own mind. "Take him in," the sheriff said. Jace's face contorted. "You can't." "I can," the sheriff replied. "And I will. We'll see what else turns up once we start looking." The deputy seized Jace's arm. For a moment Jace twisted, his eyes wild as they snapped to Maggie. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Maggie's voice was soft, almost gentle. "No," she said. "I already regretted you. I'm finished with that." As the door closed behind him, the room fell quiet. Maggie stared at the empty space where he'd stood, and something inside her loosened, like a knot, finally cut, not untangled. Thomas turned toward her, his gaze intense, his voice low. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, and her eyes filled, not with fear now, but with the kind of emotion that makes a person tremble because it is too large to hold. "I think," she whispered, "this is the first time I've ever felt truly safe." Thomas's thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, and the tenderness of it nearly undid her. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life keeping it that way," he said. The words hit her like thunder, not loud, but deep, shaking the foundations of everything she had believed about herself. She swallowed, her voice barely there. "Don't say things you can't live up to." Thomas's gaze did not waver. "I don't say anything I'm not prepared to bleed for." Outside, the night had grown colder. The stars were sharp points of light above the dark roofs, and the street lamps threw pale halos on the ground. Maggie and Thomas walked back to the wagon in silence, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was full of aftermath, full of promise, full of a future that was no longer a fragile wish. When they reached the ranch, the windows glowed warm against the dark. Silas met them at the door, the baby cradled carefully in his arms, like something priceless. Maggie rushed forward, breath catching as she took her daughter back, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. "She fussed a little," Silas said quietly. "Then she slept, like she knew you'd come back." Maggie's eyes burned. "Thank you." Silas nodded once and stepped away, giving them the privacy they didn't know how to ask for. In the kitchen, Thomas poured water, his movements slow now, as if the night had carved something open inside him. Maggie sat near the fire, with the baby in her arms, watching him with a heart too full to keep quiet. "You stood in front of him," she said softly, "and you didn't flinch." Thomas looked at her, and the firelight made his eyes look almost silver. "Neither did you." Maggie's throat tightened. "I didn't know I had that in me." "You did," he said. "You just needed someone who wouldn't punish you for being strong." The baby shifted, making a small sound. Maggie rocked her gently. "She needs a name," she whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it real at last. Thomas stepped closer and crouched beside her chair, his gaze moving from the baby's tiny face to Maggie's. "What name do you hear when you look at her?" Maggie stared down at her daughter, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "Grace," she whispered, "because I don't know what else to call what brought us here, because it feels like a mercy I never earned." Thomas's voice turned rough with emotion. "Grace?" he repeated as if the name were holy. Maggie looked up at him. "Do you think it's foolish?" Thomas shook his head. "I think it's true." For a moment, neither moved. The fire crackled. The house breathed around them, warm and alive. Then Thomas reached into his pocket and drew out something small and simple, a ring, plain gold, worn by time as if it had waited patiently for this moment. Maggie's breath stopped. "I had it," he said quietly, "for years. I thought it was meant for someone else, for a life I never built, but I understand now that it was meant for the day I finally learned what a home is." Her voice broke. "Thomas," he took her hand, careful, reverent, as though holding it was both privilege and promise. "Maggie Caldwell," he said softly, "I can't give you a perfect world. I can't silence every tongue in Abilene, but I can give you my name, my roof, my life. Every day I have left, not out of duty, not out of rescue." He looked at her as if she were the only light in the room. "Out of love," he finished. Maggie's whole body trembled, the kind of trembling that comes when a person stands at the edge of everything they've ever wanted and still can't believe the ground will hold. "You don't have to," she whispered. "You've already given me. I want to," he said, his voice steady, sure, unbreakable. "And I want you to choose me. Not because you're afraid, not because you need shelter, because your heart says yes." Maggie pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling faster now. Then she looked down at Grace, at the sleeping face, at the tiny fist curled in blanket folds, and she understood something with sudden clarity. She had spent her life begging for a place to belong. She had never imagined belonging could feel like this. Not ownership, not obligation, but devotion. She lifted her gaze to Thomas, and her voice was soft but certain. "Yes," she whispered, "I choose you." Thomas exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath for years. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that did not shake, though his eyes were bright. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, slow and careful, not claiming, not taking, only honoring. It was the kiss of a man who had built fences all his life and finally discovered what it meant to open a gate. Maggie's eyes closed, and for a moment the world disappeared. There was only warmth and steadiness, and the sweet ache of being loved without punishment. When they parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his voice a whisper against her skin. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Maggie's fingers tightened around his. "Neither am I," she whispered back. And in the quiet that followed, with the fire burning steady, and Grace breathing softly in her mother's arms, the Whitaker house held something it had never held before. Not just peace, a future. The Texas plains had changed, though not as much as one might think. The wind still sang across the tall grass in low, haunting notes. The sky still stretched wide and endless above the horizon, and every sunset still bled into the land like a slow fire that refused to die. But where the old Whitaker ranch once stood in quiet solitude, life now bloomed in abundance. The house was larger, its porch newly built and wrapped in vines of white morning glories. A second barn stood by the windmill, and laughter, bright, high, and full of mischief, carried on the breeze. Thomas Whitaker leaned against the porch rail, his hands weathered, his hair now touched with silver at the temples. The years had deepened the lines at the corners of his eyes, but there was gentleness there too, the kind that comes only from a life well fought for and well loved. Behind him, the screen door creaked open, and Maggie stepped out, her shawl draped over her shoulders despite the warm morning. "Thomas," she said softly, smiling in that quiet way that never failed to undo him. "You promised to fix that latch before winter." He turned to her, grinning. "I did, and I will, just as soon as the herd stops needing me every 5 minutes." She laughed, a sound as warm as the sunlight. "You always have an excuse, and you always see through it," he replied. The teasing was familiar, but beneath it lay something deeper, something that had only grown with the passing years. Theirs was not the desperate love of youth, but the steady fire that endures all storms, the kind that warms instead of burns. Maggie moved beside him, resting her hand lightly on his arm. Her hair, still dark but streaked now with threads of silver, was pinned in a loose twist. Her eyes carried the same quiet strength they had 7 years ago, though softer now, content. "Where's Grace?" Thomas asked, glancing toward the yard. "She's down by the creek with Silas's boy," Maggie said, her tone half fond, half worried. "She's teaching him how to skip stones, and likely bossing him while she's at it." Thomas chuckled. "She gets that from you." "She gets her stubbornness from you," Maggie countered, smiling. Their daughter was 7 now, bright, fearless, curious about everything. The townsfolk of Abilene had once whispered about her birth, but whispers had faded, as they always did when faced with honesty that refused to bow. The Whitakers had rebuilt their place in the town, not through pride, but through quiet, steady decency. People came to Thomas for advice, to Maggie for kindness, and to Grace for laughter. Even Mrs. Briggs, once the town's loudest voice of condemnation, had grown quieter with age. Her boarding house stood empty now, her health failing, and though pride had kept her distant, it was Maggie who brought her baskets of food in winter. Some wounds, it seemed, could only be healed by those who had once been their victims. Silas had stayed on the ranch, his hair gone white, his hands still strong. He called Grace his little deputy and taught her to ride, to lasso, to respect the rhythm of the land. He joked often that the ranch would one day belong to her, and Thomas never argued. As for the town, it too had begun to shift. The church no longer refused unmarried mothers at its doors. The schoolhouse, built in part with funds from the Whitaker ranch, welcomed children without question of who their fathers were. The town that had once thrived on judgment had learned, slowly and painfully, that mercy bore better fruit. But not all stories found redemption. Jace Mallory's name had long since faded from Abilene's gossip. Word came years ago that he'd been killed in a barroom fight in Santa Fe, another man's debt bringing him to his end. Thomas had said little when the news arrived, only folded the letter and set it aside. Maggie had said a quiet prayer, not for him, but for the girl she had once been, who had loved him and suffered for it. She prayed that somewhere in that final moment he had remembered the face of the child he'd never met and felt, however briefly, remorse. The baby who had once been a secret burden had grown into a joy that filled the house. Grace was a mirror of both her parents. Maggie's eyes and quiet thoughtfulness, Thomas's stubborn streak and unflinching sense of right. She loved the land fiercely and rode her pony across the plains like someone born to command them. This morning, she came running up the hill, her braids flying, cheeks flushed from the wind. "Mama, Papa," she called, "I found something." "What is it, little one?" Maggie asked, as Grace skidded to a stop before them. The girl held out her hands, palms open, revealing a small, perfectly smooth stone shaped like a heart. "For you," she said solemnly. Maggie knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Grace's smile was pure sunlight. "It's lucky. You have to keep it." Thomas took the stone and turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the strange perfection. He looked at Maggie, and for a moment, all the years between the frightened girl who had arrived on his doorstep and the woman standing before him seemed to fold into one truth, that everything they had endured, every loss, every fight, had led here. "I'll keep it," he said softly. "Always." Grace beamed and ran off again, her laughter echoing through the yard. Maggie watched her go, her heart full. "She's growing so fast," she murmured. "Sometimes I blink and she's taller." Thomas smiled faintly. "Children have a way of doing that. They grow while we're busy remembering." Maggie looked up at him, her gaze tender. "Do you ever think about those first days? How impossible everything seemed?" "Every day," he admitted. "But when I do, I don't remember the fear anymore. Just the light that came after." She reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek. "You gave me that light." He took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, his voice deep and rough. "We gave it to each other." They stood there in the quiet, the world spinning gently around them. The wind moved through the wheat fields, making the stalks bow and rise again, endless as forgiveness. From inside the house, the clock chimed noon. Maggie turned toward the sound, her shawl fluttering around her shoulders. "Come," she said. "Grace will be hungry soon, and Silas says he's making stew." Thomas laughed softly. "Then I suppose even heaven can wait." He followed her inside, the door closing softly behind them. The house was warm, alive with the smell of bread baking and the faint echo of laughter. On the mantel above the fire sat a single-framed photograph, faded now, but still clear enough to show a young woman in a simple dress, standing beside a man whose hand rested protectively at her back. In her arms she held a baby swaddled in white. Behind them stretched the Texas plains, vast and eternal. The photograph had been taken the day Grace was baptized, not by a preacher who judged, but by one who believed that every soul deserved blessing. Maggie had cried that day, not for what was past, but for what had survived. As the years went on, new pictures joined the first. Grace at 5, standing on a hay bale, Silas with a pipe and a proud grin, Maggie and Thomas at the edge of a wheat field at sunset, their hands entwined. But the first photo always remained at the center, because it told the story of where love began, not in perfection, but in ruin, not in ease, but in courage. And outside, as the sun sank low and the sky burned red and gold, The wind carried the sound of laughter across the land, a man's deep and steady, a woman's soft and warm, and a child's bright and wild, all blending together until it became one music, the kind that time could not silence. Love had endured. It always did. Sometimes the most powerful stories are not about victory in grand battles, but about survival in the quiet ones, the kind fought within the heart. Maggie's journey through shame, struggle, and forgiveness reminds us that even the deepest wounds can give birth to something beautiful. Love, when it is true, does not arrive in perfection. It grows through courage, patience, and kindness. Thomas taught us that redemption isn't found in words, but in actions, the quiet, steady ones that heal what life has broken. And Grace, the little girl whose very name carries meaning, became the living proof that hope can bloom from pain, and that mercy can rewrite any past. If you felt this story touch something within you, if you saw yourself or someone you love reflected in its moments of fear, strength, and tenderness, tell us in the comments what this tale meant to you. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word grace below, because that single word now carries everything this story stood for: forgiveness, love, and the courage to begin again. Your comments not only let us know you were here, they help this story reach new hearts who might need its light today. If you wish to support the team that brings these emotional journeys to life, you can send a super thanks on YouTube in whatever amount you can or wish. Every gesture of support helps us keep creating these heartfelt historical romances for you. And if that's not possible right now, sharing this story with a friend or loved one is just as powerful a way to help it live on. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for believing with us. And before you go, don't miss the other touching tales we've left for you in the cards above, each one filled with love, redemption, and the timeless beauty of second chances. Because just like Maggie, Thomas, and little Grace, we all deserve a place where the past can rest and the heart can finally call itself home.